You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Professor Terry Maley, a professor of political theory at York University, who specializes in the thought of Sheldon Wolin, Herbert Marcuse, and Max Weber, and has published books on all of these thinkers, most recently Envisioning Democracy, which is on Sheldon Wolin and some other democratic theory ideas. Today we're going to talk about the thought of what I think is one of the most underappreciated theorists, Sheldon Wolin, who has written, of course, most famously, ManagedDemocracy and the Specter of Inverted Totalitarianism, his book, Democracy Incorporated, famously popularized by Chris Hedges. And Sheldon Wolin's one of those thinkers who doesn't really get discussed enough, probably because he doesn't fit so neatly into a Marxist camp, even though he's definitely on the radical left. And he's often not read by liberals, and he problematizes a lot of liberal assumptions regarding democracy. So without further ado, we're going to get straight into Sheldon Wolin. And usually what we do on this show is, why should people care? There's so many thinkers one could read, and there's people have only so much time and energy. Why should we care about Sheldon Wolin? What got you into the work of Wolin?
Well, thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me on. And I'm really happy to be able to talk about Wolin and Max Weber, as you mentioned as well. With regard to Wolin, you mentioned a couple of interesting things already that I wanted to pick up on, or that I was going to think about or think out loud about. And one of them is that Wolin was a political theorist, right? And trained as a political thinker in political philosophy. And he taught at Berkeley, and we started out in the late 50s and early 60s, was caught up in the free speech movement at Berkeley, then went to Princeton, which is a pretty elite place in a lot of ways, and did a lot of writing on the tradition of Western political theory. But a couple of things you mentioned about his later work, for example, Managed Democracy, and is this famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, idea of inverted totalitarianism, which he wrote about just before the second George Bush election in an article in The Nation magazine in 2004. Wolin certainly was on the radical left, as you said, but another thing you said is also right, and that is he was hard to pin down because he wasn't a Marxist, even though he was sympathetic certainly to a number of Marxian themes, if you like, or in the Marx revival of the past 20 or 30 years. A number of things like class, the nature of the state, global capital, those kinds of things, the influence of the big corporations. Those were all themes in his later work as well, like Managed Democracy. Wolin's focus was on how those things affected democracy and democratic participation in a lot of ways, and a lot of his writing and his public commentary too. And another thing I wanted to mention about Wolin was he didn't see himself, and he didn't see political theory, his own or anybody else's political theory, as just an ivory tower exercise, as just something people should engage in among philosophers, among the kind of elite few, if you like, who had access to these philosophical ideas and the training and the time and the leisure, as we were talking about before, to study all this stuff, to spend all their time studying and writing about these things. He was also a political commentator at times. He started a kind of a journal called Democracy with a small d, right? Democracy with a small d, just after Ronald Reagan got elected in the US in 1980. And that ran for 3 or 4 years until it ran out of funding. But still, he started a Democracy, which is part theory stuff and part commentary on political events of the day. And so he was he was also at times kind of a public intellectual, although maybe not quite as high profile as some of the people we might think of today. For example, he didn't have maybe the profile of Naomi Klein, who has become an academic more recently, or Cornel West, for example. Wolin produced a lot of amazing students who've taken the mission, if you like, of doing theory.
Wendy Brown. Right.
That's right. Wendy Brown. That's right. Absolutely. A number of them. My co-editor of the book that you mentioned, John Wallach, who did more work on the ancient Greek democracy and liberalism, but a whole range of others. In the book, there's Terrence Ball and Stephen Esquith and a number of other of Wolin's students who went out into academia and into the public world and into politics. And were all inspired by, they weren't a kind of coherent school, if you like, that thought one way about democracy or about what could produce either greater democratic participation or what was blocking it. But the number of the theorists that you mentioned were kind of all public intellectuals in some ways and scholar activists in a lot of ways, and talked about different aspects of democracy and why it was important. So that's for sure. And Wolin was also, he didn't take his own job. He didn't think theory was, as I said, an ivory tower thing. He thought it should be a more practical thing and something that people could use and engage with in their everyday lives and in whatever participation they could and they had time for in their own local or other contexts. So he definitely had a resistance to the idea that theory was this elite thing that could only be done in the ivory tower university. Now, going back to where I first ran into Sheldon Wolin, and I appreciate your asking about that because it gives me a chance to talk about a little bit of my own intersection of biography and theory, if you like. Now, when I started, I did my PhD at University of Toronto, which is a kind of, in Canadian terms, I guess, an elite institution. And they had a great political theory program. Okay, that's good. And on one side of it, there was a scholar named C.B. McPherson, who was a kind of Canadian Marxian-oriented thinker who did critiques of liberalism and the history of the traditional liberal ideas in politics. And there was a kind of left group around him, a very diverse left group who did all kinds of stuff. That's where I first learned Weber and about Marcuse and critical theory, the Frankfurt School critical theorists, and a lot of stuff about the global South and democratic politics just generally that was more critical in its orientation, right, towards liberalism and liberal democracy. On the other side, the other half of the theory program were followers of Leo Strauss, a political theorist named Leo Strauss, who was a scholar of Plato and Aristotle and ancient Greek thought in a much more elite kind of way, if I can put it that way, a more elitist sort of way, to give a really shorthand version of Strauss. And his main person at U of T, one of his main followers was a guy named Alan Bloom. I don't know if you remember the book, The Closing of the American Mind, but that was...
I've actually been reading it because I've been
Oh,
trying.
really? Yeah.
Well, people on the show know I've been wrestling with Leo Strauss a little bit. I find some of his stuff useful while being pretty opposed to his politics. I didn't know that Alan Bloom was at U of T, though, actually.
Alan Bloom was at U of T, that's right. And he and Strauss were close. And just on the mention of Strauss is a very substantial thinker, right? You can't just dismiss his ideas out of hand. He in his studies of Plato and Aristotle and the ancient Greek thought, he had a certain view of that, which was not democratic, right, in Wolin's sense. And his followers were also not so democratic. They were much more right-wing, right? They were much more prone to supporting the Republicans in the U.S., and their politics were much more hierarchical, if you like, and kind of elitist and right-wing, if I can put it that way. And so there were these two camps there, and in the department. And one of the first things it did, it gave me a perspective, and I think that's what Wolin's work did. And Wolin's first major work, which was called Politics and Vision, which was a selective history of the history of Western political thought, gave students and me and others a really interesting kind of idea of the fact that a lot of these great thinkers, if you like, in the Western canon, the Western tradition of political theory, had very different perspectives on what politics should be. And from Wolin's perspective in his later work, where he was more explicitly concerned with democracy, they also had very different perspectives on democracy and what democracy was, how much there should be, who should participate, all those kinds of things. So I first came across Wolin in the context of being in the lefty part of the department at University of Toronto. And in contrast, and I think it sharpened my appreciation of Wolin's work, both his earlier work on the history of Western political thought, and then the later work that you mentioned as well, which actually talks about the lack of democracy, or how, in a lot of ways, how anti-democratic modern Western societies in the US particularly had become, right? And in his later work, Wolin talks about how close big capital and the state are, and how much personnel goes back and forth in managed democracy, for example, between Wall Street and the State Department in the U.S. and the White House, those kinds of things. And so Wolin came to have what many people thought was a much more critical view, or if you like, a radical left view of, I guess, of existing American democracy in the 90s and 2000s. And his Politics and Vision was released as a second expanded edition of that book in 2004. And then Managed Democracy came out in 2008. And that was right towards the end of his career, one of his last major pieces of work. And so he became much more critical. And I remember from some of my colleagues and profs at U of T, at University of Toronto, how they didn't like that turn that Wolin took, right? They didn't like him, the turn from just looking at the history of Western political thought to the more radically critical version of his thinking later on. But I want to go back for a second to the early stuff and how much of an eye opener it was in a sense, and put that in context a bit. So that early book, Politics and Vision, was written in 1960. And it was just 2 years before this C.B. Macpherson, whom I mentioned at University of Toronto, came up with his own critique of liberalism called the theory of possessive individualism in Hobbes and Locke. And Macpherson pointed out that Hobbes, these early liberal thinkers, whom we tend to forget about these days, they're not very publicly discussed, but these early liberal thinkers had these ideas of how we came to see ourselves in a competitive market society as possessions, right? And Marx would later call it commodities, basically, as commodity. And we tend to commodify our own works and talents and abilities because that's what you have to do in a market society, right? That's what everybody has to do. And so Macpherson had this idea that Hobbes and Locke already reflected some of that early market mentality in the liberal tradition. And he contrasted that with John Stuart Mill, who was a late 19th century liberal, who had a more socially developmental vision of liberalism, as you like. And Macpherson said, well, the problem with, and you get a sense of this kind of thing in Wolin's work as well. The problem, Macpherson said, was that there are two strands of liberalism. There's the more market-oriented liberalism that says, I just want my property and I want to compete in the marketplace on the one hand. And there's a more humanistic side of liberalism that says people are individuals and we should be able to develop our own capacities and talents and abilities. And the problem that Macpherson had was that the market side often won out or predominated over the developmental side. So not everybody gets to develop their capacities and abilities. We don't all get to do that. It depends on what class you're in, what color, what race, et cetera, what gender, all of those kinds of things that we're more used to today as markers of inequality, of social inequality. So when that book came out, of Macpherson's, that came out just after Wolin's book, and Wolin's book went back and looked at Hobbes and Locke and the whole tradition in a selective way, not everybody, but the tradition of Western political thought against the backdrop of when they were both writing at first, which was the Cold War, right? It was the Cold War on the one hand, and it was also a time in which political science was, there was a lot of behavioral stuff, right? Behavioralism. There was a lot of, the idea was predominant that poli-sci was a scientific kind of thing, a social science. And you could do voting studies and you could do studies of quantitative studies of voting behavior and things like, and people's voting attitudes. And the tradition of political theory had kind of been lost. And Wolin kind of single-handedly revived it, right? He brought back Plato and Aristotle and Machiavelli and Hobbes and Locke and all the great thinkers of the tradition, so to speak, and brought them back into play and emphasized not the scientific, technical aspect of what was current political science at the time, as I mentioned, like voting studies. How many people, and Robert Dahl, a famous American political scientist, did voting studies in New Hampshire and that kind of thing. And not the sort of mainstream political science at the time, which looked just at the way things are and figured out how it worked. But Wolin was more interested in the title of his work, in Politics and Vision, in what the visions were, what the different visions were that the different theorists had of politics in their own time and place. And what that did was it forced people who did theory to step back and say, okay, our version of doing theory, or our version of liberal democracy, or our version, and some of your listeners might remember that around that time in the late 50s and early 60s, American political thinkers like Robert Dahl and not Dahl, but others as well said, well, America is the best of all possible worlds, right? It's the best of all possible worlds. And liberal democracy was the kind of
Karl Popper, yeah.
That's great. Daniel Bell, right? Some others as well.
Because Robert Dahl becomes more critical, does he not? He writes his polemic against the American Constitution.
Yeah, he does later on. That's right. Yes, that's quite true. Yeah. He does as well. That's right. He became more critical too. And many people did after the Vietnam War in the 60s, the cultural turmoil of the 60s, which, as we know, didn't change the system, but it changed a lot of people's values and attitudes. That's certainly true. So One Dimensional Man, you mentioned Marcuse, One Dimensional Man came out in 1964 and was part of a wave of thinking then that was culturally and politically critical of the way things had been in the post-war kind of conformist suburban image of the post-war in the US. And so that was some of the early significance of Wolin's work. Everybody then began reading Politics and Vision, and it became widely used in undergrad courses and whatnot in political theory because people were learning about these different views of politics from all these different thinkers historically. So Wolin kind of said he thought he wanted to revive the tradition of political theory to provide a kind of resource or set of resources, intellectually, if you like, and culturally, to get people thinking differently about politics, and that these ideas had some value. And as mentioned, he went through various phases. He wrote articles in public magazines like The Nation and elsewhere. He founded his own journal, Democracy, in the 80s and the early 1980s. And the later turn, though, in his work that you mentioned is where, as I was saying, some people didn't like that so much. They thought, well, wait a minute. And this is some of my colleagues who are maybe more influenced by Hannah Arendt or Kant, right? Or like Immanuel Kant's thinking. And were maybe not quite as, if you like, radical or critical as Wolin became. He came to the view that the existing organization and structure of democracy as it was in the US in the 80s and 90s wasn't democratic any longer. It wasn't working in a way that democracy should. In the mid-90s, he came out with this famous in academic circles, at least, an article called Fugitive Democracy. And in Fugitive Democracy, he said, well, democracy is really about people, ordinary people, being able to get together and come up with democratic arrangements and deliberate and discuss and make decisions on their own, right? On their own. And they should be free to do that at any point in time, right? And they're capable of doing that at any point in time. But under the given system of managed democracy, which is a big capitalist machine, a big capitalist engine, if you like, economically and politically, where there's a big, very bureaucratic state that's highly specialized and technical, he said most people can't do that. And so he thought political theory and political participation was something most working people in our modern complicated societies don't have time to do, right? Most people have to work for a living. And so they can't participate as actively and as equally as Wolin wanted them to be. Now, that doesn't mean everybody is or should be exactly equal. It doesn't mean everybody has the same talents and abilities, right? And it doesn't mean leveling the economy. It doesn't mean making everybody absolutely equal by state decree or something like that. But what Wolin began to take issue with was that the nature of the big bureaucratic market society that we live in, the big kind of capitalist society that we live in with large institutions that are complicated and very technical and specialized, it really prevented most people most of the time from doing democracy, right? From doing democracy. Now, another key idea that Wolin thought and that he became concerned with more and more in the 80s and 90s was he saw the modern world as kind of more and more fragmented, or the postmodern world, as he called it, as more and more fragmented. It was fragmented culturally. It was fragmented by social class. It was fragmented politically in the sense that they were different. The state had different sources of power in some sense, even though power is very concentrated, but they were different kinds of elites who were running things at the top of the state or at the top of corporate bureaucracies and that kind of thing. And so he became increasingly concerned about the fragmenting nature of modern society culturally as well. And one of the things he thought democracy brought out or was capable of was finding commonalities, right? Finding what people had in common, if you like. And he was very concerned about the fact that that was disappearing or that was under assault and our world was being fragmented to the point where, and the way he put it is kind of like an image of a circle going around a hurricane or something. He talked about centrifugal forces, which sounds like a fancy term, but really he just meant the forces of modern culture and society are whipping around and shooting off in different directions. And there isn't anything like a glue any longer that holds them together, right? And so the implication of that was that capitalist culture and even the modern state weren't capable of doing that on its own. And for Wolin, liberalism as an ideology wasn't capable of doing that on its own either. Liberalism didn't provide enough of a common ground, in other words, for people to be able to bond together and have a sense of community, which for him was a big part of what a democracy was. Now, in the book that I just co-edited with my colleague, John Wallach, There's one of the contributors is a young scholar named Lucy Kane, and Lucy's just written a book a couple of years ago on Wolin. It's the first book-length study of Wolin's work. And she makes a couple of interesting points. She's a bit critical of Wolin in some ways. She thinks his focus on neoliberalism, in other words, modern capitalist version of the state and the economy in neoliberalism, maybe didn't pay enough attention to the possibility that people like Trump could emerge, strong leaders like Trump could emerge, or that we have a resurgence of the kind of racism and xenophobia that we've seen recently. Not just, of which Trump is a symbol, right? Trump didn't create all that. He's just a symbol of those things erupting now again. And I don't know. I'm not sure I would blame Wolin quite, if you like, or be critical of him for not being able to see those things, because I think his critique at the time that he was doing it emphasized a lot of the things that he did that are really important, namely the inaccessibility of the modern state or modern state institutions and the inaccessibility of a highly unequal kind of postmodern capitalism, if you like. But I think Wendy Brown, who was one of Wolin's students, right, one of his best known students, who was a political theorist, who wrote a book in 2019 called In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, which I'd recommend to everybody. I think it's an amazing kind of text on where we are culturally and politically at this point in time. And Brown says, she talks about both the history of neoliberalism and its founding in the 50s as this kind of radical right libertarian ideology. But she talks about, and the whole discussion of neoliberalism has kind of come out of critiques of globalization, both on the left, on the far left, and on the right? In Europe, there was a whole critique of globalization already going on in the 1980s and 90s that we're not that familiar with in North America. But there were critiques of globalization from both sides, if you like, and its fragmenting effects, and the fact that globalization and global capitalism basically disrupted local cultures and disrupted identities, if you like, and replace them with a kind of more homogeneous global marketed products and the culture industries, et cetera, that kind of thing. And Wendy Brown says in The Ruins of Neoliberalism that she doesn't think that this unleashing, this very aggressive and hostile unleashing of xenophobia, racism, sexism, et cetera, on the far right is a direct result, is actually caused by neoliberalism. But she thinks it opened the way for these things to be unleashed. When people became frustrated with globalization, the economy, et cetera, that kind of thing. And I think she's got a point. I think that's right. And I think you can see that as a step beyond what Wolin was doing, but that he was certainly aware of when he talked about these forces spinning around culturally and spinning off in directions that are not good and not democratic, right? So Wolin was a Democrat. I think even in his earlier work, after Politics and Vision, he was concerned with democracy. But later on, from the kind of 90s onwards to his later work that you mentioned, he was much more concerned with being able to revive and renew democracy at the local. Some people say at the local level, maybe a bit harder to imagine on a bigger scale, if you like. But he came around at the end of his work, and so Lucy Kane also raises this issue of whether Wolin was really at the end of his work a kind of social democrat or not, because there were points at which in his work he was very critical of institutions. Period. Right. There were points at which you can read him as saying, well, institutionalizing politics or creating constitutions, right?
Yeah, he's been read as an anarchist.
That's right.
There's a couple of people who've straight up said he is an anarchist.
Yeah.
I actually don't fully even really agree with his conclusions, or at least I'm not convinced by them, but I find him just magnificent as a thinker, and we'll get to why, but I don't want to interrupt from what you were
No
about to say
worries.
with regard to his that sort of local politics or debates regarding solutions, because I think he wasn't even quite clear himself as to the future, because he had on the one hand his own sort of, I guess you could say, maybe idealist vision,
Yeah.
but he also, I think his diagnosis is extremely realist,
Yeah.
because his whole view of democracy is that all democracies that have states are, for the most part, generally managed democracies to some extent. Because I was thinking we could get into that, but I don't know if you have something to say before that about, because starting with his work, I think starting with his critique of constitutions is how we can understand his critique of managed democracy, because
Yeah.
many people who just read Managed Democracy think he's only talking about the US, and he is with regard to inverted totalitarianism mostly, even though he thinks it could apply to other places. He's really developing, I think, a framework for understanding democracy that fills a certain gap in the Marxist analysis. And that's why I think he's important, because some people who might be listening to this who are Marxists will say, well, why, like, Marx already critiqued liberalism. Why do we need to read this? And I've been through Marx, and I would consider myself on the heterodox Marxist spectrum for sure. And Wolin doesn't reject many of Marx's critiques. I mean, he has a wonderful chapter on him in Politics and Vision, which I think is simultaneously a great acknowledgement of Marx's insights and a critique of his weakness as a political theorist. And I think a lot of people have pointed that out, rightly so. Marx, in many ways, kind of had a theory of everything rather than a theory of politics.
Yeah.
But what I thought was, Marxists tend to have this tendency, that sounds redundant, but they usually think of liberal democracy and bourgeois democracy as just a monolithic thing. So they say, well, all democracy that has capitalism can never really be democratic because you have classes who will be represented by the bourgeois state. And it's like, fair enough, that's true. But the issue with that sort of framework is that it homogenizes all liberal democracies. It doesn't consider the fact that some can have way less possibilities than others,
Mhm.
meaning that will be huge for the reform revolution debate and strategy going forth. And also, it kind of brackets out any sort of historical evolution of liberal democracies,
Mhm.
because liberal democracies at some point were way more democratic and less democratic at different periods. Like early American Revolution, in some ways, was less democratic in the sense of, you could say, property ownership, but more democratic in terms of participation.
Mhm.
Ver We could say pre-Constitution America was one of the most radical democratic experiments ever in modern history. And he acknowledges that, and he goes to that chronology. And that's why I think a great way of understanding Wolin is having a sort of holistic breakdown, like you just gave, of his career and evolution, then going into the particular, starting with the universal particular, then back to the universal,
Mhm.
that dialectical way, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely right, though, about you mentioned some people think he's anarchistic in his thinking because he seems to be at times. And that's a good way of putting it. You can see that tendency in his work, or some people call him, or I prefer to call him, a radical Democrat in a way. But he's not a Marxist. You're absolutely right about that. He's sympathetic, but he thinks that Marx didn't pay enough attention to politics. And there's always a question in Wolin's work as to whether or not, is in that Fugitive Democracy piece from the mid 90s, he says, well, there's politics and there's the political. And politics is the ordinary contestation over elections and things like that in the institutions and structures, just the way things are, the way politics is elections and the way institutions are run and that kind of thing. The political, though, is the part that has the vision, right? The political is often, he thinks it's a moment where people can get together and redefine or renew what politics is, of and beyond the fray of ordinary everyday politics and just the way things work normally. And it's an attempt to redefine that, in other words, and reshape it maybe with a new vision or some new ideas. And Wolin was kind of looking for, so the idea of a renewal was big for him, and how to renew democratic politics. And one of the problems he had in this later phase of his work that we were talking about was that in managed democracies, and that raises another actually really interesting and important question. And that is, can you have big societies and big democracies of any kind that are not managed somehow in some way? But what he's talking about is more critical. He's talking about managed democracies being democracies in which the people are managed and may be manipulated and steered into certain directions and confined in terms of how they can participate to voting and that kind of thing. Voting, maybe participating once every 4 years, that sort of stuff. And he was very, as you say, he was very sharply critical of the way in which modern liberal democratic institutions, and you're right that they're on a continuum. They're not all homogeneous. They're not all liberal democracies are the same. American democracy didn't stay the same over its historical development, right? Canadian democracy isn't the same now as it was 50 years ago, when it was much more restrictive and white and et cetera, right? Those kinds of things. So, and much more openly accepting of capitalist elites, for example, running the economy and that kind of thing. So you're absolutely right about that. And he was always looking for ways and for openings, I guess, in which fugitive democracy could work and function. Now, on the reform revolution question, that's another really interesting question you raised, because people don't tend to see revolution as being on the horizon immediately in the global north, at least anytime soon, right? And in this there's a book by Nicholas Zenos, who is another student of Wolin's, who is a professor at UMass Amherst. And he put together a collection of Wolin's key essays just before Wolin passed away. And it came out, Wolin passed away in 2015, and the book came out in 2016, I think. And Wolin has a little introduction because he worked with Xenos on putting the last parts of it together. And he has a little preface in which he says, by that point, having been through his whole career and reflected back on his own work and on where the US was going in the later 2000s, Wolin says, well, maybe social democracy is it. Maybe social democracy is the only thing at this point that can meaningfully blunt the hard edges of capitalism and neoliberalism, that kind of thing. And so there's a debate that Lucy Kane and others that she has in her book, for example, about whether Wolin was kind of a social democrat or whether he was even more critical than that. And I agree though, completely with your idea that he has an extremely sharp diagnosis, right? An extremely sharp diagnosis of what the problems and what the issues are in terms of democracy being able to realize itself more fully in a more participatory way so that more people can participate in making their own decisions in the context we're in. And his diagnosis of that, I think, remains really acute. That's still to this day, right? Still to this day. And if you look at some of those other issues, such as the issues of race, of gender, et cetera, and of neoliberalism in its more ongoing form today, I think that some of Wolin's key ideas are taken up in some of his students' work, like Wendy Brown and Cornel West and whatnot. And I think they're just as relevant now as they were. Now, the kind of conclusion that Wolin came to right toward the end of his life, that maybe social democracy is the only thing that can keep capitalism, neoliberalism, and capitalism in check these days and blunt its worst effects, if you like. Okay, that's a position, but I don't think that's a view. And many of my friends on the left share that to some extent. But I don't think that takes away from his critique of managed democracies. But this other question, though, that we talked about before a bit as well, as to whether, and this is what used to exercise Wolin's critics, right? Wolin's liberal and social democratic critics sometimes said, well, he doesn't like institutions at all. How can you have democracy, or how can you have politics at all if you don't want institutions or constitutions? And Wolin said, as soon as you get constitutions, you begin to get hierarchies that get fixed, right? That get enshrined in a certain view of a political order that can be fixed, or that it leads over time, can cement into place, if you like. And then they become hard to change or hard to get rid of. So look at the US Senate today, or look at rather the US Congress, right? With its complete dysfunction in terms of, with the divisiveness and the polarization going on, Congress is really getting nothing done at all, right? And it's completely deadlocked in terms of some of the major and key issues of the day, whether it's the border in the southern US, of course, the border with Mexico, or whether it's abortion rights, whether it's the Voting Rights Act, or whether it's international aid, for example, support for Israel or Gaza or Ukraine. All of those things are deadlocked, and they're mired in this institutional context that most people don't know about, most people don't have access to, and most people don't know how they work. They can see that they don't work, but they don't have access to reforming and changing them themselves. And I think Wolin's critique of those issues is extremely acute, and still is. Now, on the solution side, that's the more complicated problem. That's the more complicated issue, because it's clear in some sense you have to have some kind of institutionalization of some sort, but how extensive it is, how layered and deep it is, and how encrusted it gets is really the question that he was trying to address in this idea of fugitive democracy, where he thought you could only have democracy in smaller settings, more spontaneously, not all the time, right? Not continuously, but that it would erupt, the democratic moments would erupt, and people would be able to form themselves into a democratic body more at the local level, or that kind of thing. And that's a complicated question. That's a complex issue. But you're right also that he refused to pin himself down. He refused to be pinned down as either a Marxist, and he wasn't fully an anarchist in the anarchist tradition, but he wasn't postmodern either. He wasn't a post-structuralist.
Very anti-postmodern.
Yeah. And in his work, he comes, in terms of these intellectual and cultural debates, he comes out and he's quite critical of post-structuralism for attacking the idea of any kind of ground or foundation whatsoever. But I've had people say at public presentations I've given, I gave a talk at a conference on utopia in France, in Paris, in 2015 or 16, and I gave a paper on Wolin and Marcuse. And there's a French thinker named Miguel Abonseur who didn't read Wolin's work, and they weren't familiar with each other, but they're quite parallel in a lot of ways. And Abonseur, after Claude Lefort, had this idea of insurgent democracy, savage democracy, or insurgent democracy. And savage democracy was Lefort's idea, and insurgent was Abonceur's idea. And it's the same idea. It's the same dissatisfaction with the existing institutional frameworks and their rigidity and inability to be changed. Now, some people would say right away, as soon as I said that, some people would say, well, what about, for example, gay rights in the US? What about the courts, for example, that for 3 decades expanded a series of rights, the voting rights, rights for Black and Latino people, Americans, that is, in the US, or gay rights. And those victories were won through the court. Well, we can just as easily see how under a different configuration of a different kind of managed democracy, right? That's managed more from the right, from the far right, if you like, that has greater influence today. Those kinds of institutions can go in very different directions.
Mhm.
And so the Supreme Court now, for example, in the US is a very problematic institution, right? So it's not the institution itself necessarily, but Wolin wasn't even sure that he liked those, that he didn't even want too many of those institutions to be too layered and bureaucratized and rationalized. But the question that he's posing, I think, when he talks about fugitive democracy and people being able to get together and find common ground and make decisions for themselves and form themselves into a democratic unit for purposes of deciding something at the more local level, is how do you deal with the bigger issues that Wolin raised and that he was aware of in Max Weber, for example, this early 20th century sociologist who talked about the rise of science and instrumental rationality. In other words, a kind of reasonable rationality that could be used to create and direct big institutions, and the state, the modern state, right, which continues to be a problem. I mean, what we've seen in terms of the rise of the modern state the way it's worked in the late 20th century is it almost doesn't matter exactly what the political stripe of a certain government is, whether it's liberal or conservative or social democratic or that kind of thing. The modern state still has enormous resources that any of those kinds of governments that are temporary can use and deploy if they want to, and often in ways that are not good. Now, that's not to say that, on the other hand, this guy, Max Weber, in the early 20th century, who did some of the pioneering early 20th century studies of the modern state in relation to democracy. And Weber wasn't, he was a kind of elite Democrat. He didn't think, he didn't have Wolin's ideas of democracy at all, really, right? In terms of being more egalitarian, participatory, those kinds of things. He thought there needed to be charismatic leaders who could act as a counterweight to the modern state, if you like, and steer it in more liberal. He was a liberal, basically, in his time, just around the time of the First World War, and just
He's
after
like a self-critical liberal. Like,
yeah,
I think
super
he's
critical.
almost like a Nietzschean sociologist if he
Well,
had the insights of Marx, but
th-
without the politics of Marx in some sense, because
that's right. That's
looking at a
right.
lot of the same problems, but
Yeah,
he is looking at how do you stabilize a liberal order,
yeah,
and how do you prevent, or how do you deal with these issues of modernity, like
yeah,
rationalization, the need for controlling the complexities of modern society, and
yeah,
how do you deal with disenchantment that
yeah.
comes with
Exactly.
science and
Right.
the scientification of everything and objective measuring of everything. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that is actually a great bridge to the chronology of Wolin's thought, because when we talk about managed democracy, there's really a chronology of that, and probably the best example of this. So, I mean, this is all in Democracy Incorporated, but
Yeah.
through Politics and Vision, what I think is so good about that work and why it's considered his best academic work
Yeah.
is because he really arrives at his conclusions not through starting off with like an idealist politics and rationalizing his way there, or trying to just recreate theories to justify what he already wants, but he really does, and chapter by chapter, starting with Plato, starting with the classics, the antiquity, then going to medieval and Christian thought,
Mhm.
then
Mhm.
to Machiavelli and modern political science with Hobbes. And it's very helpful, honestly, if you just want a history of political science,
Yeah. Yeah.
of
Yeah.
political theory, to really read that book. It's very long, those like 500 pages.
Yeah.
But he, in the second half, mainly does a great job of detailing the chronology of management of democracy. He uses the term technologization of politics. I really
Mhm.
like that, of
Mhm.
how he uses Weber's theories, as you were mentioning, on how increasingly democracy is controlled. And people think today usually only in terms of things like campaign finance.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
all of this stuff like advertising, the control already in the workplace,
Yeah.
this how do we get workers to perform as well as possible with Taylorism? And
Yeah.
how do you get people to buy things they don't want? You have this change in society, and this reflects itself in the political realm, which he's writing about. And I think when he gets to his conclusions towards the end about about managed democracy and inverted totalitarianism,
Mhm.
it's not just that he hates America or anything. I mean, the guy was a pilot in World War
Mhm.
II, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so he's seen a lot of epochs. He's seen World War II. He's seen, the post-war social democratic welfare state stable era that Marcuse was writing about, and then he
Mhm.
sees neoliberalism.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's seen quite a lot. He's been through a lot, and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think,
that's right, that's right.
yeah, and I mean, we're talking about the management of politics in Weber. I guess while we're there, why don't we go back a little bit because we touched on it with the constitutions, because some
Mhm,
people might think that's crazy. Constitution is anti-democratic. Isn't that what democracy is?
mhm, mhm,
And I mean, he says constitutions restrict the scope of politics.
mhm,
They limit how much politics is available. And then he talks about fugitive democracy, like this sort of radical break, a rupture in that.
mhm.
I guess, how would you detail the chronology of constitutions, then to management, then to how he gets to manage democracy? Because I think that's worth getting into to avoid a only US centric view of this,
Right,
or a simultaneously conflating it with just, oh, this is bourgeois democracy.
right,
Because, yeah, it is bourgeois democracy, but there's levels to this. I mean, it's changed significantly, and that means it changes solutions.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's worth getting into, I think.
Sure, no, absolutely. It's the idea of, and Wolin was kind of had affinities with other thinkers who look back at the founding, the US founding, and the US Constitution and whatnot, like Ellen Meekson's Wood, who was more of a political Marxist in a sense. She wrote in a more Marxian vein, but she also wrote in a book called Democracy Against Capitalism, right? She also wrote about, and was a contemporary and colleague of Wallen's, about the fact that the founding of the US Constitution and many other constitutions were like this too, that didn't come out of a revolutionary context, if you like. In the Anglo American democracies, for example, Canada didn't have a revolution. We're not a revolutionary country in that sense. The Brits don't even, in the UK, they don't even have a written constitution because their constitutional principles are so ancient. In other words, they go back more than 1,000 years. So there are different variations on the theme, if you like, of whether you need some kind of regulatory structure or that sets down the guiding principles, right? The guardrails, if you like, of what a polity is going to look like. So what institutions are going to be, who can vote, what the legal system is going to be like. Those things are all set out. What rights people have, right? Those things are all set out in constitution. And one at times, I know what you mean about the kind of anarchist view, if you like. So there's people say, well, he didn't really, he thought that any kind of constitutional form would start to solidify and restrict people's ability to participate and put it into a hierarchical form. And that's not the same everywhere. And it changes over time, as we're saying before as well. So I think though, I think your point is right that what I mean, about Wallen focusing mostly on the US context and mostly writing about the American example. But it doesn't mean that doesn't mean that applies exclusively to the US. So the idea, for example, of managed democracy is is something Wolin was writing about specifically in the later part of his career, as we said, about the American situation and linking that back historically to the way in which the founding in terms of the American Constitution and its framework, what was not set up to be democratic in the way that he envisioned it to be, in the way that he wanted it to be ideally.
Well, yeah, we should specify by the founding, he means the framing of the
Yeah,
Constitution, because he actually does think the revolution
yeah,
was radically
yeah.
democratic in many respects. I mean, we
That's
can
right.
say with today's lenses that it's
Yeah.
whatever problematic. I mean, sure, but for its context, it is pretty radical. I mean, it,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
and that's why some people have debates as to whether the Constitution was a counter-revolution or not. I'm not sure if I
Mhm.
fully buy that, because if we judge it as a bourgeois republic, it's maybe the fulfillment of bourgeois democracy,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
stabilization of it. But I guess that you're getting to this example of how the Constitution restricted the scope of the democracy,
Yeah. Yeah.
because people forget that the revolution was this radical movement of,
Mhm.
I mean, like town halls and
Yeah.
participation. It wasn't just massive property owners. It was
No.
artisans and shopkeepers, and I mean, it's quite incredible. I mean, in that regard, I actually do really like Gordon Wood's book, the radicalism of the American Revolution. I think it's a little overly
Mhm.
rosy in how it portrays it, but I mean, it does show some facts about
Yeah. Sure.
this that we forget about.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, it was a rupture, certainly, for sure. And it was a rupture of democratic energies still coming up and stilling forth. I mean, Cornel West has an interesting video that he, from some years ago, that he gave at the Left Forum, this Left Forum conference or meeting that used to take place in New York City every June. And he was there with Richard Wolff, I think, is, an economist at UMass Amherst, a radical left economist. And he was talking about Thomas Paine, right? And Thomas Paine's pamphlets in the Revolutionary era, and then how Paine went to England and then France and got in trouble in France and wound up in jail in the Bastille and whatnot, almost got taken off to the guillotine, and just managed to avoid that. But the point he was making was that between the revolutionary upheaval and the subsequent discussions of the Constitution, there was already a conservatizing influence, and some of the founders already thought that Paine was too radical, in the sense that he wanted to continue some of those energies in a different direction or push them further, right? Some of those eruptive revolutionary energies. So it's certainly true. It's certainly true that it was an eruptive moment. It was different in France, of course. The revolution in France was quite different because there was a different context, but had some of the same affinities. So some of those same disruptive, eruptive energies, if you like, democratic energies, in which a lot of people from different parts of society participated and whatnot, as you mentioned. That's quite true. What Ellen Wood talks about, for example, in terms of the eventual framing of the Constitution, was differences, even with the differences between Madison and Jefferson and the others, which were at times significant, but how the Constitution, and I'm not a constitutional expert in American terms by any means, but the framing of the Constitution took on a more conservative a cast, which was designed to contain those democratic energies to some extent, and designed, of course, to have some of the more elite folks in society represent the others, right? And the assumption, as some of the founders thought, that they would be able to represent the interests of everybody else if they, in that form of representative democracy that they founded, in a sense. And of course, in some of the European context, it was very different. I mean, there were different kinds of founding in some of the social democracies, for example, in Northern Europe, and their constitutional arrangements, which in some cases like Sweden and Norway, even though they're now subject to the same neoliberal forces globally that all countries are subject to, in a sense, culturally and economically, they still have some greater ideas of equality, for example, on gender related issues than exist elsewhere. So that there are historical variations, and there are different national and cultural variations too, definitely. Absolutely. But the question of constitutions is, how easy are they to influence and amend and renew, along Wolin's theme of renewal? How easy do they make democratic renewal, in a sense? And that is, in the American context, that's a problem. And so you get a lot of civil society associations, as Tocqueville first mentioned about the US, right? You get a lot of civil society, a lot of civic activism, if you like. And some of that selectively finds its way into the political process in terms of politics versus the political. But it tends to establish a new political, right? A new vision of politics, if you like, and to either change the institutions from within or to change the party system, for example, have proved to be quite difficult. And so
Yeah.
look at
Very
Bernie
difficult here too in Canada.
Absolutely
Incredibly
ridiculous here
difficult.
too. That's right. And in most places where the kind of established structures remain in place, they do provide stability. They're capable of providing at times significant protection for rights and those kinds of things, but they don't change fundamentally very often or very easily. I mean, look at Bernie Sanders, right? I made the analogy in the past couple of years of the insurgency that Sanders had into the Democratic Party in the US and Corbyn in the UK when he tried to change the Labour Party. And those two things, those two sort of movements from the outside that tried to change one of the established parties were very difficult in both cases, right? And ultimately failed. So it's all those different dimensions of the institutional structure as it's first laid out in the Constitution, and then how it evolves and changes and develops. For example, in the US, how the party system developed into a two-party system and has made it very difficult for third parties to get in the door, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
then gerrymandering and all these
Oh
like
yeah,
tactics of
absolutely.
managed democracy.
Absolutely. And those aren't just managed democracy in the sense of let's manage a capitalist democracy in the sense of a state that is more favorable to the interests of capital, et cetera, that kind of thing, along the lines that Ralph Miliband would talk, for example, or Poulantzas, and Nikos Poulantzas, in the more Marxian theories of the state. Not just those, but this is actually kind of a regularized kind of almost criminality in a sense, right? It's tampering with the laws or bending them or getting around them to gerrymander districts and all of that kind of thing. And that's a different kind of managed democracy. That's a different version. That's not quite what Wolin was thinking, I think, in that sense. But it's
He gives examples of stuff like that in
yeah, he does.
Democracy Incorporated. A big example is the whole obsession with voter studies and segmenting people into
Yeah,
voting demographics and
yeah,
appealing to these individual demographics, and this pulls people in all these different directions,
yeah,
depoliticizing them effectively
yeah,
and manipulating them because they're
yeah,
treated like consumer demographics. So how do we get people to buy this? How do we appeal to people's most psychological instincts? It's very the opposite of participation, the idea that you're a citizen,
yeah,
which
absolutely.
people forget that democracy this is my where I think his I don't get how anyone could think that Sheldon Wolin is a social democrat. If so, maybe a very radical social democrat.
Mhm,
But
mhm,
his whole conception is totally at odds with the way social democrats today think of democracy as voting,
yeah,
and they always are obsessed with whether people can vote for multi parties. Whereas that doesn't really, even if you do have many parties, sure it's better than having two or one.
yeah,
Maybe.
mhm,
That's even not necessarily, but
yeah.
if it's everyone is so heavily managed,
I
I mean,
know.
in terms of bombarded, voting is it's a rather than participation, and people forget that this is early liberalism.
Yeah,
So, this is radical liberalism, is you're a citizen who has to actually be informed on issues, and we don't even have to look far back to see when that was kind of better. I mean,
yeah,
the election of Lincoln, famously, they had to do speeches for 6 hours,
mhm,
and
yeah,
people had
yeah,
to watch it, and you really had to
yeah,
ask, them all sort of questions, but we don't have that today. I mean, the media barely wants, P they're scared to ask Joe Biden about his mental condition, let
yeah, yeah.
al
That's right.
let alone about his, policy on Palestine, but that's a whole 'nother story.
Yeah, yeah, that's right, that's right. No, you're right, it's very complicated because it's Marcuse, for example, you mentioned Marcuse earlier, One-Dimensional Man, which came out just 4 years after Politics and Vision. Marcuse had this kind of totalizing vision or also a diagnosis, a very acute diagnosis of the problems of the sort of conformism of the post-war 1950s period, et cetera, and that kind of thing. And how kind of Marcuse in that book wasn't even concerned with democracy per se, because he'd assumed that citizens had been totally incorporated, right, into the system, into consumerism and into that sort of suburban consumerist world of the 50s and early 60s until it began to blow apart. But the question I think that even against Marcuse's more totalizing vision, just before the mid 60s, shortly after that, Marcuse was to say when the student movement started up and the anti-Vietnam War movement, even against the background of that conformism, there's always resistance, right? There's always pushback at some point. People can push back, and they do, and they can organize. And I think Wolin's idea of fugitive democracy later on in the context of neoliberalism by the mid 1990s when Wolin came up with the idea of fugitive democracy, really, and that became more widely known among his readers and among his in theory circles in a way. Even in a context that's managed,
Yeah, exactly.
it's more totalizing.
Well, yeah, and he has a cynical position where he thinks maybe this is the only kind of democracy left,
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's
especially in
right.
the American context, and he gives the civil rights movement as an example of
Yeah, yeah,
fugitive democracy because it's outside of the
yeah,
existing order. Because if you're playing the exact rules of the game rather
yeah,
than trying to radically rupture them,
yeah,
then it's managed democracy. You're basically doing everyday politics. It's administration. It's not in the political where we're contesting visions,
yeah, yeah.
actual
Fundamentally, that's
visions.
right.
And
Yeah,
as you mentioned, this is a whole debate with French political theory as well, and even Marxist French
yeah,
thinkers like
yeah,
I think goes a little too far in rejecting parliamentarism entirely because I think he's actually way to the left of the likes of Engels and Marx who believed in revolutionary republicanism. They also believe in representative democracy.
yeah.
That's something we'll get into maybe in the back room after about socialist managed democracy because this is
Right, right.
something I have wrestled with a lot because we
Yeah,
might
yeah, yeah, yeah,
forget that managed democracy, like Sheldon Wolin, on one hand, he's critiquing capitalism for
yeah,
leading uh, to a system where it's almost at odds with democracy, and he
yeah,
says the liberty component of liberal democracy is always has been at odds with democracy. It,
yeah,
so he accepts the Marxist critique of capitalism,
yeah.
but what is even bigger in his whole analysis of democracies, it does apply to I mean, if some people consider Soviet Union capitalist,
Mhm.
not really, but
Yeah, yeah.
sure, maybe like different kind of whatever you want to call it.
Mhm,
I think it's applicable to Soviet Union or many
mhm.
different systems that are not just capitalists, and we have to take seriously. This is something that isn't in his work, but I mean, you could only write about so much.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think what the future of Wolin's scholarship really has to think about is what is socialist democracy, managed democracy is inevitable, because or else you're in a position where I think you can flirt with radical anarchism or outside of state, or you can flirt with council communism, which I kind of think is a bit of a fantasy now because of
Mhm. Yeah,
the different makeup of how workers are so different. Also, communism never really seemed to, we don't have a lot of examples of that actually working,
yeah,
especially in a big context, because they might just represent their own interests.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, this is kind of what happened in the brief experiment
Right.
in the Soviet Union. People forget Lenin tried to give
Yeah,
factories to workers and stuff like that.
yeah, yeah,
But how
yeah,
do we prevent I think this is crucial of a full-on dictatorship, especially a one in which because some people who are MLs, Marxist-Leninists in my
yeah,
audience, might say,
yeah,
"Well, Soviet Union had democracy. They had a system of a parliament in which people would vote on things, and
yeah,
you
yeah,
had elected representatives." But it was I would say, yes, I actually think but it's totally a managed democracy.
yeah, yeah.
And sure, maybe that's inevitable, but we have the rest of already if we're talking about managed democracy, I think it's more helpful
Mhm.
than thinking of it as this binary between absolute totalitarianism, dictatorship, and liberal democracy or not, or pure democracy, even more unhelpful.
Yeah,
Because as we know nowadays, how do you deal with the new despotisms?
yeah, that's right.
Like these states
Yeah,
like Russia, who they are liberal democracies on paper, but
yeah.
they don't function like ones at all.
Oh, no, that's right. Yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah.
go even further than John Keane.
Yes, it's
I don't think even the liberal democracies function like liberal democracies either. So they're
oh, sure, sure. There's a continuum there. So it's a continuum, right? It's a
yeah,
and it has
spectrum.
gaps and breaks and whatnot as well. And, right, sorry, that's just my phone ringing. I'll just let that go for a second. It's a complicated story. It's a complicated story that you're right, doesn't have one answer historically or in the current or in the current moment. And so the idea of, I mean, the way in which democracy, for example, in the US, just get back to the US for a minute, had been managed, if you like, had been managed in Wolin's vision in the mid to late 2000s before the current Trumpist turn to the far right took place, and Trump symbolized that. This is, he didn't create it, but he's the symbol of those changes. Even that form of managed democracy it was under sort of criticism from both the left and the right. And because of the changes that have occurred, I think that are grounded in neoliberalism and the way neoliberalism has insecuritized or made the large portions of the population more insecure and more precarious. If you like, it's created this environment in which the old version of managed democracy is starting to come under it, has been under attack and is starting to crumble and collapse. And the new version hasn't arisen yet, right? But it's not a new version of managed democracy from the left or even social democracy. And that's the big fight these days, right? Do you try to sort of either capture or reform to some extent or renew those institutions, right? And that's kind of what the Democrats want to do. They want to say we have to defend the existing institutions.
That's the paradox. They're trying to manage democracy even more to
Yeah,
prevent Trump from getting. They're trying to literally prevent him from running
yeah,
with the
yeah.
Colorado
That's
courts,
the
right?
court decision, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because they don't, if Trump got in, or if it became a Viktor Orban kind of or Putin kind of state, like Hungary or like Russia is now, it wouldn't be managed democracy. It would be a managed authoritarian something, right? An illiberal democracy, if you like, where the judicial system was taken over or captured, and they put their people in there. Where the senior reaches of the state were captured, where the business relationships, as John Keane says in his book, are all clientelistic. And if you're an oligarch, it's because you're a friend of Putin's or something like that. And you can see the same thing potentially happening in the States. So the key question is, I had one,
I don't, but I know. Well, I just think is 90% of legislatures,
yeah,
including local, are Democrats still.
yeah, yes, that's true. Yeah,
So,
that's
I
right.
mean, most of the country isn't with Trump. I actually think
Yeah,
I think if Trump was to try to do Orban, which I believe he is, because I think he's a narcissist. I do believe he's striving for total power and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I don't deny that. But I think what the liberals are more afraid of is legitimacy. I say more the liberal elites. I think
Yeah.
more regular liberal scholars genuinely have a
Yeah.
panic about dictatorship. But I think what they're afraid of is legitimacy of American democracy, because what would happen if Trump, who I don't think has that, he doesn't have the majority of Americans.
Yeah.
He's really only in there because the opposition is what at this point is a Ronald McDonald statue, and he had a warmonger as his previous opponent. So I mean, it's pretty. It, he doesn't have that much popular support.
Yeah.
And I think if he was to try to establish that kind of power without that, American democracy would have such a lack of legitimacy. Because I mean, the whole how is a system legitimized popular sovereignty, power to the people? You have such an unpopular president.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a crisis for the state. They won't be able to exercise their hegemony globally, perhaps not even domestically. I mean, you have movies. If you heard about the new movie coming out, Civil War,
Yeah. Right. Right. Sure.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's looking pretty scary for the American system. And I
No,
think it's more about legitimacy than it is dictatorship, because even if Trump tried to establish a dictatorship, which I'd find it hard to believe how he would do that,
yeah.
and without a war context, because the Americans can establish a dictatorship in the sense that they can dissolve the Constitution if there's a threat of war. Ever
Mm.
since Reagan, interestingly, that's called the Doomsday Project.
Yeah.
Interesting, scary stuff.
Yeah.
But they could do that, but I think that would be the greatest recipe, and I say greatest not in a good way, a recipe for revolution. I mean, because Americans have that, it's written by their founders, right to rebel against a despotic government. That's
Yeah.
Jefferson's own words.
Yeah.
Locke, of course, famously.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the I don't think they would want a situation like that that would allow for that right. What I think ruling classes who are very divided would prefer is that people solve the problems of crisis just by voting in and out the
Mhm.
different parties who will make unfulfilled promises. Because I think Putin and Orban are much more insecure regimes.
Mhm.
If they underperform,
Yeah.
they face a threat. I mean, I don't get how people can still talk about Putin's regime as if it's so almighty. I mean, he almost had a private military organization just walk in.
Richard to Moscow. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
incredible weakness. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
Americans were terrified by January 6th, a bunch of incompetent like people, just clowns storming the. That could have been a coup against Putin.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was a real possibility, and that's weakness, and I think we overlook that as legitimacy.
Yeah.
I do wanna get into Weber after, because
Yeah.
this is
Sure.
where in my work that I've been doing is, I think when we talk about managed democracy,
Yeah.
the differences between liberal and quote unquote illiberal democracy has a lot to do with legitimacy. And when we talk about we enter a tradition that's a little bit outside of traditional liberal thinking
Yeah.
and more into Weber, which there's pe I call it, I know people don't call it this, I just call it realist liberalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's I don't know how you're a Weber scholar. So
Well, sure. Well, no, Weber's very interesting in this regard. But back to the institutions for a second. In terms, I mean, if you listen to in the past year during the Trump regime, if you like, when Trump was president, and then after January 6th, the mainstream media commentators, like you listen to CNN or even MSNBC, like the Rachel Maddow view, the kind of liberal left or the somewhat further left view, if you like, they would at times openly or a fair bit actually say, well, the institutions have held, the institutions are holding. And that's quite an admission. Well, that's quite an admission in a lot of ways, that in the face of the Trumpist wave, if you like, of the various assaults and disinformation and everything else, and interference by Russia and China and all the rest of it, on the social media front, the whole sort of context, if you like, that the institutions, in spite of all that, are still holding. The key question, which people are asking at this point, which was Bernie Sanders and others aren't asking at this point, is, well, if the institutions do hold under this pressure to undermine them from the right, in other words, the previous form of managed democracy, the neoliberal form of managed democracy, in other words, it's been in place for the past, or that's consolidated itself over the past 20 or 30 years. If that's now being undermined and attacked, and Trump would ideally like to get rid of much of it and concentrate control and power for himself in the office of the president, for example, and appoint all his own people and all that kind of thing. If that's the case, then what are the progressive alternatives? And I think you can repurpose the idea of fugitive democracy, if you like, to say, well, there's now, in the context that we're in, there's a lot of pushback, and people are using whatever means they can, using referenda, for example, on the abortion question, right? To enshrine abortion right in state constitutions, like in Wisconsin, I think it was recently. And so you've got a situation there where, even though constitutions may have originally, or many years ago, been instruments for consolidating, if you like, class power, let's say, right? Or the predominant white power in the US, or those kinds of things, they can be used perhaps in different directions. They can be used for different things. And now they're being used, for example, to enshrine abortion rights, like pro-abortion right, in favor of abortion rights. And women are voting for those, even some maybe moderate Republican women or independent women, as they call them, as they classify them in the way the election strategy people parse different demographics into these segments that vote for things. And as you mentioned before. So those same institutions, I think, have some flexibility and can be used when push comes to shove, if they have to be, for different purposes. But whether or not, in other words, if I don't know how it's going to go in terms of how the next election is going to go, of course, and whether or not the system will change gradually, or maybe not so gradually, but more fundamentally. If Trump does win, that'll clearly be a crisis of various sorts. But even if Biden wins, or somebody takes over from Biden, right? After that, even if he wins, what's going to be the result of that? And is it going to go back to what is, in other words, the new form of managed democracy going to be? Is it just going to be a kind of return to the kind of neoliberal form, which was part of the problem in the first place, right? I mean, that's part of what has produced this whole Trumpist backlash from the far right, the xenophobia, the sexism, all of that stuff, is the fact that neoliberalism, as the predominant form of managed democracy that Wolin was still writing about, doesn't work, right?
Right. And of course, to clarify, I mean, he thinks managed democracy is way before that. Like, he's not just, it's only neoliberalism, but it's the latest form. And I mean, it's related to, neoliberalism is more related to inverted totalitarianism, which we didn't actually really get into. I mean, it's directly related to managed democracy. People often think these are synonyms, but they're not.
Yeah.
I think we'll discuss that in the Back Room podcast, which you can get access to by becoming a patron, and as well as this question, which Wolin doesn't discuss, is what is alternative democracy look like, and what is a socialist conception of managed democracy? How do we stay realist on the one hand, and how do we build a better society on the other hand? These are pretty crucial questions, and so and if you don't have the means to support, feel free to give a 5-star rating. As usual, helps the podcast a lot. And take care. See you there.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you're, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.